National Union of South African Students was formed in 1924. At first, it was a white organization. Inspired by the rise of Afrikaner nationalism, Afrikaans students left NUSAS and formed their own organizations. NUSAS was then free to address issues of racial discrimination. Fort Hare was the first black university to become a member of NUSAS in 1945.
News from Government House, Pretoria, where South Africa's newly elected Prime Minister, Dr. Malan, was sworn in by the Governor-General of the Union, Mr. Van Zyl. Accompanied by their wives, Dr. Malan and Mr. Van Zyl posed for the cameras at the beginning of a new chapter in South Africa's history.
In 1948, the Nationalist Party came to power and began implementing apartheid policies. The 1959 Act led to the establishment of so-called tribal colleges.
The quality of the education is itself poor, designed in such a way that it is to produce people who will only serve the white people and not the community as a whole or the society. And it does not portray the type of life that we are leading. It does not conform to the socio-economic conditions that black people live in.
Black students could only attend white campuses with ministerial permission. The early 1960s featured a ruthless stamping out of resistance politics.
And you need to recognize as well that at the time, most of the leadership was in prison or were in exile. The political organizations were banned. And whatever political work, there was not even, let alone what ANC and MK say today, there was not even a semblance of underground work happening in the country. There wasn't any.
Following Verwoerd's assassination on September 6, 1966, Minister of Justice John Balthazar Vorster became Prime Minister. Under Vorster's leadership, the security state reached its pinnacle.
That we whites in this country have a right to maintain our white identity under all circumstances.
It was pretty much a police state, wasn't it? It was everybody who didn't toe the line was detained, was locked up, with all those draconian measures of detention without trial.
In 1966, NUSAS President Ian Robertson invited Senator Robert Kennedy, brother of assassinated US President John F. Kennedy, to speak at a NUSAS ceremony. The aim of the invitation was to win support for the anti-apartheid campaign and to embarrass the government.
He arrived with all the paraphernalia of American razzmatazz. He had a motorcade, the like of which Cape Town had never seen. We didn't have television, of course, and he brought his TV cameras and lights and things and took over the place. We had the Jamison Hall absolutely packed.
But actually, I did hear a story this afternoon which concerned me. It was a story that Ian Robertson, Chief Latuli, and I went for a boat ride in the Indian Ocean, and and the boat sank, and who do you think was saved? The country.
White students embarrassing the government, because apartheid at the time was not perceived subjectively I think by its architects and rulers, to be something that was as evil as the rest of the world perceived it to be. It was done with a moral gloss to it, and a gloss of religious fervor and conviction. It was a creed, it was a belief, it was a mission. And anyone who upset that, especially people with some credibility overseas, the bringing of Kennedy out was a severe embarrassment to the government. The continual vocal opposition by the privileged sons of white society and the privileged daughters of white society.
Come gather around people wherever you roam and admit that the waters...
Through actions like mass protests and sit-ins, NUSAS was a thorn in the side of the government. The international student rebellions of the late 1960s were amongst the reasons for Vorster's increased attention on NUSAS.
I mean, it was a NUSAS tactic to create confrontation, to create the sort of situation at St. George's Cathedral, to arouse the student movement against the government, to get them radicalized, and to get them to swing behind and into the workers' movement and all this, and to create a really revolutionary situation, as had happened in Europe.
The CRS are now 3 deep, solid line of them. They're gradually driving the students back away from the Sorbonne, which is now in the hands of the police, and are now starting to rip up street signs recently erected. They're ripping up paving stones. And now they've got a group of students cornered in a churchyard. The students are coming out with their hands up. The students are filing out of the churchyard with their hands on their heads.
I came to university in '68, which was the year of the Paris Rebellion. I think it was the year of Berkeley. It was the beginning of the International Student Rebellion, and it certainly had an influence on me. We used to read what they were writing, read about what they were doing, see films, and so there was certainly an influence, particularly from the Americans and some romantic notions, I think, from the French and the Germans, and also from the British. Whether they had a really powerful influence, I don't know. I suppose it encouraged us. When we had a sit-in at UCT in '68, we all thought of sit-ins that were taking place in other parts of the world and made us feel part of some big international conspiracy. But the truth was that what we were fighting was very different from what they were fighting. They were fighting capitalism. We were fighting apartheid. What we were fighting was a more visible, a more easy target, and a more vicious target.
The Prime Minister, Mr. Vorster, warned the people behind the student unrest that he would not hesitate to act against them as in the past. Mr. Vorster also warned the universities that the government was getting tired of warning them. The time was coming for drastic action against...
Vorster's fear of the students, however exaggerated, did have some historical foundation. A group of NUSAS activists joined the African resistance movement in the early 1960s. ARM was an anti-apartheid organization involved in acts of sabotage. After blowing up electricity pylons and railway signaling cables, ARM was swiftly suppressed by the government. John T. Driver, NUSAS president in 1964, called for militancy, but the rank-and-file members had no desire to become involved in an armed struggle.
Maar ek kom nou by die saak wat baie druk deur u almal bespreek is. Dit is namelijk die optrede wat in die jongste tyd teenoor sekere studentenleiers gedoen is. Leiers van die beweging NUSAS. Hier het jy met 'n organisasie te maak waar jou vlag verag en jou volkslied verwerp.
Forster then had been Minister of Police, and he had been waging the vendetta against NUSAS much more seriously than Verwoerd did. He was obsessive about NUSAS. He must have formed the conviction that this was the white contribution to the communist conspiracy that he saw, because it really was, you know, going for Sparrows with a machine gun, but he was fanatical and ferocious.
Forster's police state dictated the way in which student activities operated. The state harassed individuals, opened their mail, taped their conversations, and removed passports. In extreme cases, bannings and detentions were ordered.
There was a public meeting in the Rondebosch Town Hall at which Helen Joseph was speaking, which was organized by the SRC. I was chairing it. I can't remember what the event or the occasion was. The meeting was disrupted by someone who threw some sort of pepper bombs or sneeze bombs into the hall, and the meeting was very badly disrupted. At the end of the meeting, I felt I ought to go and report it to the police. Quite why I felt that, I don't know. I went off to the Rondebosch police station and started reporting on this, and they said, oh no, we've already got a report on that. And I said, well, that's very strange, I've just come from the meeting. And they said, what do you mean a meeting? And it turned out what they were talking about was a petrol bomb and an attack on a house. And when I questioned them a bit more closely, it turned out it was my house that had been bombed. When I went there, I discovered that what had happened was that somebody had knocked on the door, a white man, had asked for somebody who wasn't living there, and when the fairly dozy person with whom I lived, or one of the people with whom I lived, closed the door, somehow put something in around the door, some sort of incendiary device, closed the door, went off, and the next thing the whole thing exploded. The house was very badly damaged structurally, and the owners eventually pulled it down. It wasn't worth repairing. There was never any sign of any serious police activity to try to find out who they were, of course.
State repression affected my family life much more. My mother, who was a widow, was often phoned late at night by the security police and asked, you know, like, do you know where your daughter is? And I was in an SRC meeting, sort of till 2 in the morning or something. And one night she actually came up to the SRC at 2 in the morning and saw that I was there and was quite relieved, because the security police had obviously been telling her that, you know, whatever, that I'd been killed on the highway or anything. That was much more severe.
I mean, one of my favorite recollections, that I wasn't the cause of being searched. My sister ran prison education for NUSAS in the late 60s, which was a very brave thing to do, because that was considered absolutely out of court by the regime, to get foreign money and send it to people like Mbeki and Sisulu for their UNISA studies. And that was, again, the kind of thing that only NUSAS dared to do. And my sister ran that scheme for NUSAS, and in mid-1969, there were a series of police raids countrywide, and I and my girlfriend were sharing her house in Parktown. And this comes to why it was apropos. The police kicked on the door at dawn and came bounding in and wanted to search. And they very quickly found the prison education files that they were looking for, including also the Christmas card on the mantelpiece, which was from a political prisoner, you know, saying, we are preparing to beat our plowshares into swords. The kinds of things that the police thought was jolly good evidence. They then thought they'd search the rest of the house. Well, while they were going through my sister's files, my brother-in-law was wandering through the house with piles of laundry. Wondered what on earth he was doing. Well, there he had his copies of New Left Review and Eddie Rue's Time Longer Than Rope, wrapped up. 6 o'clock's a bit of a crazy time to do laundry, you know, hiding them in the fridge, in the kitchen. And I had been reading a banned book. I think it was more pornographic than political. And, you know, as the bang came on the door, that went out the window into the shrubbery. Well, of course, little did we realize that there's police right around the house. But the police orders hadn't been to confiscate all the stuff coming out of the windows. It was just to stop us jumping out of the window. So they just sat and watched as, you know, all these belongings emptied out of the house.
And the last kind of belongings was Ned, the graphic artist, who had the third wing of the house, and he sent his entire stash of dope into the shrubbery as the police watched all around.
White students were banned, but we were banned and we were arrested, we were tortured and that sort of thing. I think it took some time before whites could be honored with the worst of the torture tactics.
First of all, we said as black students, we could not participate in multiracial organizations, which were by far white organizations, because in this country there is an overwhelming number of white students at university. And secondly, these organizations were concentrating mainly on problems which were affecting the white student community, which meant that NUSAS, as an organization, gave political opinions which were largely affected by the whiteness of that particular organization.
We have to be able to gather the strength. You must be able to get the guts as the intellectuals of the black society to say, we are black. Our noses are broad. Our lips are thick. Our hair is nappy. And we are beautiful. And we are beautiful. And we are beautiful. And we are beautiful. Yes.
Feeling the need to address their own issues and influenced by the American Black Power movement, black students broke away from NUSAS. They formed the South African student organization, SASO, in 1969. This followed NUSAS's inability to function as a multiracial organization.
In 1967, NUSAS conference at Rhodes in Grahamstown. Rhodes University refused to allow African delegates to live in the residences of the university. All the other delegates could live in the residences, but African students were supposed to go and live in Tanki, in the African location, and they were being bused into the university every day to the conference. And Steve Biko, who was a delegate from Natal University, was the first one to say that no, this just, why is this being allowed? Why is this continuing? And I said, well, it's the law. And I said, well, if this is the law, then why don't we break it? Why don't we, if we're committed to transformation of this country, why do we deal with this law? Why don't we get rid of this law? Why don't we defy this law?
That really was the last straw, and it really brought home to everybody how difficult it was to talk about a common set of student interests when black and white students really encountered very different experiences, even if they attended the same institutions. And it was on that kind of basis that black students started organizing on their own.
At the graduation ceremony in 1972, Abram Tiro, a University of the North student, unexpectedly attacked the apartheid education system. He was subsequently expelled. Fellow students went on strike and were also expelled. In sympathy and in support of equal education, NUSAS held nationwide protests.
The moment these people have cleared the steps, I am going to clear this pavement and I'm going to use force. And that should be perfectly clear to each and every one of you. This is an illegal meeting and this is where I start. You've got exactly 3 minutes and then I'm going to use...
The first tear gas bombs were hurled into the crowd at 23 minutes past 2. Intermittently throughout the afternoon, more tear gas bombs were thrown. At 20 minutes to 4, the police moved in again and arrested about 40 students from the steps of the cathedral. They resisted arrest and were dragged and shoved to a waiting police van.
The police attacked us, wielding batons, rubber truncheons, and as they attacked us, I remember attempting to block the police by linking arms with people on both sides of me, who were both women. The police charged straight into us and knocked down the 2 women on both sides of me, and I remember distinctly seeing this young blonde policeman staring me in the eyes and trying to kick me in the groin.
But I discovered on that day that the church is not sacrosanct. I mean, there were police charging up the aisles of the cathedral, behind the altar, beating students up. And it was horrifying, absolutely horrifying.
I was walking towards St. George's Cathedral on the second day, all right? And the police said, now we need to gather for a second day. and having to encounter within myself a desire to murder. And I think that was an extraordinarily shocking experience for me. That if I had had the capacity, i.e. whatever is needs to kill people, that I would have quite happily taken out the police, the informers that were quite evidently there, the watchers, the cameramen. And I found that quite shocking, I presume.
One of the main ways the government monitored student activity was by putting spies on the campuses.
The slogan went, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. There were endless spy scares in NUSAS. Many of them fully justified, some of them proven. The branch would get a hold on some poor kid who may have had different gender preferences or may have done something at high school that he oughtn't and had some sort of criminal record or whatever the hold was. And the branch would say, all right, we'll tell your parents or we'll publicize this or that. Or they would simply use money and get kids as spies for money. Then, of course, there was a more sophisticated set who actually believed in the right-wing racist policies and were out to get us for those reasons.
I eventually landed up with the security branch in head office in Pretoria, because that would be sort of almost the ultimate in, you know, combining my macho-ness and so on with a bit of intelligence work and so on, which was like really very appealing. It was sort of better, it was a better sort of cop job. Then eventually got back to Pretoria and sort of marched in front of this high-ranking officer and he said to me, listen, have you got matric? I said, yes. He said, have you got A stream? I said, yes. He said, you want to go to university? And I said, yes, you know. He says, which university do you want to go? You can either go to Durban or you can go to Maritzburg. So I said, I'll go to Maritzburg. I don't know, I could have said Durban, I suppose, or whatever, you know. And I said, I'll go to Maritzburg. And I said, well, you know, what is the story? He says, well, all you want to do in your first year is just to keep your identity secret. You must just be Joe Soap. I don't want you to do any intelligence work, or you just integrate with the community at the university. Okay? But obviously keep your identity quiet. I said, well, how does it work? Blah, blah, blah. He said, okay, I'll introduce you to the head of security in Pietermaritzburg. It was then Dreyer. And he was head of Koevoet later. Okay? So it was a heavy dude. I was saying, these are heavy times, John. I really, you won't believe what sort of characters I had to deal with. I was really, never mind. So, so after about, I would say about 4 or 5 months or so, I sort of started loosening up a bit. And I mean, even the girls on campus were, they looked ugly to me, you know, compared to the Afrikaner duties and cookies I was used to, you know. I mean, the whole dress, the whole atmosphere, everything was so different. And after 4 or 5 months, even the women started looking better and better and better, you know. So I sort of started integrating myself a bit better in the student society. And I learned a hell of a lot. I mean, obviously, you know, it was like a culture shock. And I started to get to know what I looked out for, the political thing, you know, coming from my background. I had to, I mean. So I looked at who was on NUSAS, and what was the student council, SRC, and, you know, what was all this protests about? Why would guys sort of actually doubt that the Nats were wrong? You know, I mean, I couldn't believe it, you know, that here was the enemy, you know. Here were the guys who were telling us that we were wrong, you know. And so it was, and to be part of the student society, you know, it was a very, very strange situation, you know.
I don't have a sense of revenge. I don't have a sense of, I don't know what I'd feel if I saw them in real life, but I do think that act of betrayal, which I can relate to, especially also about someone like Eki Eckhart for that matter. I recall organizing a seminar in Stellenbosch at the Catholic Seminary. We met there, and it was an integrated, mixed group of students. There was a great sense of solidarity in so far as we were defying the Group Areas Act, and we knew that the police was out to find us, and they did one night and came, and I think what happened was we were taken out, the black students were taken physically hold of, and the sort of liberal white students, solidarity said, where you go, we will go, and taken to the charge office in Stellenbosch. Eki Eckhart led us on, and he jumped onto the charge office desk and screamed at the top of his voice how we must fight the apartheid oppressor and everything. And all that time he was actually working for the police. And that sort of act of agent provocateur and that act of deception, I think that's really difficult.
Jimmy Cargill actually asked me to become NUSAS chairman in that year. And I said, of course, yes. I mean, now, Al, what a better place to be than to be the chairman. I mean, who would suspect you to be working for the cops? I mean, to actually gathering material for the cops. So I was pretty chuffed with that. But don't forget, I was very staunch, staunch policeman.
One expected that they would be there. And there were people like Eki Eckhart and Craig Williamson who were known to have police backgrounds. For some people that didn't matter and took them happily into their trust. I personally was very wary of anyone who'd been in the police force, so because I think there was a stronger likelihood that they would be agents.
One of the first cases that I was involved in after I'd started at the bar was a case that I did for a certain estate agent from Somerset West. And when I went through to Somerset West to consult with my client, he said to me, "Jeanette, I know you very well, but I don't suppose that you will know me." And he then told me that previously he'd worked for the security police and that he was in fact assigned to me at Stellenbosch to follow me around. And it was frightening because I'd never thought that I was followed around. I had liberal views, but I wasn't extreme. I wasn't militant. And I couldn't believe when he told me the extent to which he had followed me around, how I'd invaded my group of friends, how we socialized together. He, of course, looked totally different to what he did then. I didn't recognize him at all. And he could tell me things about me which were frightening. I felt completely invaded. I felt stripped of my privacy because of nonsense.
Forster was unrepentant about the methods he used to suppress students.
I even had one occasion when I got the 4 vice-chancellors together, Natal, Rhodes, Cape Town and Wits, to face him on the spies issue. And he wouldn't budge at all. He simply said that the students were threatened to overthrow the government, I said before. He felt fully justified in using any methods at his disposal for getting information about student activities.
In the early 1970s, NUSAS created the Wages Commission to assist in the organizing of workers. NUSAS recognized the mobilization of labor was necessary to achieve change. Linking student activity with the labor movement aroused government fears of the Rooi Gevaar. In 1972, the government launched a vicious and effective assault against NUSAS with the formation of the Schlebi-Schlechrange Commission of Inquiry. The Commission's aim was to paralyze NUSAS through the banning of its leadership and blocking overseas funding.
A group of rather elderly white gentlemen in suits who were absolutely tantalized by this talk of wild sex and drugs, horrified by this talk of communism, fascinated by these long-haired people who came in and showed them no respect for these members of parliament and could not understand what the hell was going on. It was a complete shock to their systems. They were just beyond it, past it. They couldn't understand it. The report they produced was one of the poorest and shoddiest and most intellectually bankrupt things I've ever seen.
There was a group of leaders who took it upon themselves to pose as members of the Freedom Front and the Freedom Fighters and try to create the impression that the entire English-speaking student body in NUSAS were in fact incipient revolutionaries and that they were behind the freedom struggle, and the leaders of NUSAS who went overseas to solicit funds and to create this sort of idea that there was a revolution brewing in South Africa and that they were part of it. We thought that the student leaders were misguided, we thought they were poseurs, we thought they were actors, and we thought they went around Europe bumming money which they tried to infiltrate into this country in the most amateurish fashion, and really and truly we didn't believe that they represented anybody real.
I think they actually seriously wanted to cripple NUSAS. They couldn't ban it outright. I think they felt they didn't have sufficient grounds to do that, and it would have been too provocative, both internally and externally. So they thought that the next best thing would be to cripple it by banning the leadership. And again, I think that, you know, the events overseas, what happened in Paris in 1968, what happened in the States subsequently, made them worried about the effects of student activism in terms of the ripple effects on other sectors of society, particularly as we'd become involved in the labour movement through the stimulation of wages commissions and things like that.
I don't think NUSAS was a threat to the government, but they were a threat to the stability of the country because of the espousing this, you know, radical redistribution of lands, wealth and power, socialist system, the alliance with workers, and you remember they had the wages commission and all that was intended to stir up a lot of problems.
They couldn't decide whether I could think for myself or whether I was some kind of puppet, because they operated on the basic assumption that women and blacks couldn't think for themselves.
The Schlebisch-Lagrange Commission declared NUSAS an effected organization. Its overseas funding was curtailed by the government. NUSAS leaders were banned and deported. But in the long run, this proved counterproductive as NUSAS continued its anti-regime activities.
The political intensity of those days was such that one invariably spent most of one's nights over rough red wine and cheap food, arguing into the deep hours of the morning about the politics of the day and about the extraordinary sense of idealism that grabbed us all in those days. And to the extent that that was a social life, and to the extent that that was partying, there was an awful lot of it, but very intense. And certainly none of the kind of laid-back sloth which characterizes social life today.
Yes, I mean, we were old people at the age of, in our early 20s. It was a very exciting, very, very exciting period of my life, and one learnt an incredible amount in a very short period of time. But the banning order did affect my personal life. Yes, I mean, I can still remember after being banned the sense of the world passing by, and me sitting there as an observer on it, not being able to participate fully.
I think there were probably many low points. I mean, there were many moments when we actually wondered if we were ever going to get anywhere. I mean, it seemed to be a very small number of people at that point who were saying anything, and the forces of repression seemed overwhelming at times. But no, I think overall it was a I don't think I'd be sitting where I am now if it hadn't been for NUSAS.
I now think that the most significant role NUSAS played in many ways, besides simply keeping the voice of protest alive and not letting the government get away with everything, was that it was a learning experience for students, for white students. You look around now in South Africa and you see many people who played active roles in student politics in the late 60s and the early 70s, and who learnt their politics in NUSAS. I learnt my politics in NUSAS. I am where I am because of NUSAS.
It was a successful organization within its limits. It wasn't an army. It couldn't bring about world sanctions, but it did contribute to sanctions. It, because of its white and relatively rich nature, was not going to be the organization that led the revolution against apartheid.
NUSAS provided one thread, however slender and even tangled that thread might have become at times. It does run through the broader tapestry of South African politics. It's, again, broadly speaking, left of center. From 1970 onwards, NUSAS aligned itself with increasing success with the forces of liberation, so that by the 1980s, NUSAS could locate itself quite comfortably, you know, within the UDF, within the mass democratic movement. So that I suppose one of the real claims that NUSAS can make is that it's, you know, over the decades played some role in recruiting some of the tiny minority of whites who entered, you know, liberation politics.